I guess Dakota, you looked into try to get more of a handle on how it worked in Italy, and that it really did start with Mussolini and his club in Italy, right?
Yeah, he's the OG, definitely.
Like that's where the name fascism comes. Or well, I think there were like previous roots, but like that's sort of what we ascribe as the beginning of fascism as a sort of like yeah movement.
Exactly, yeah. So, yeah, I'll just start with a bit of background then, because I think it's really important to get the context of what was going on in Europe at the time. And the first major piece of context is, of course, the First World War from 1914 to 1918. And so, leading up to the war, Italy had formed an alliance with the Central Powers made up of the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, called the Triple Alliance, as you guys probably have all heard 100 times in your history classes. But Italy had also maintained good relations with France and Russia. So there's kind of a tension there, right? That Italy wasn't fully on one side or the other. And the alliance that Italy had made with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't require that they go to war. And they saw little gain in doing so, so they held back for the first 9 months. The public in Italy wanted peace, and the top brass was pretty aware that the military was not ready for war. At the time, Italy was largely an agricultural country with a pretty weak economy. It lacked the military and industrial base necessary for the kind of large-scale warfare that was going on at the time. But after that 9-month period, Italy became convinced that there were major territorial gains that were going to be made possible by joining with the Allies, and in particular, territory that was then controlled by Austria, which shares a border with Italy. So in 1915, Italy signed in secret the Treaty of London and joined the Triple Entente, that was Britain, France, and Russia. And that treaty promised Italy control over that coveted territory. And so Italy agreed to begin campaigning against the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the south. Italy got enmeshed in this trench warfare, didn't really make very much progress, huge losses, pretty bad, yeah. Mostly defensive stuff, not much to say there, other than just horrendous.
They got their asses.
Exactly, other than just horrendous violence, yeah. But they did, crucially, gain control over the portion of Dalmatia, which they were promised in the Treaty of London. Okay, that's important. So flash forward to the Paris Peace Conference. So the war is over.
Fast forward.
Yeah, fast forward, exactly. So the war is over. We're at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 to 1920. Yep. So the Italian government is jostling with the other victors, the other allied powers, the big three, right? Britain, France, and the U.S., and they're trying to gain the spoils that they're promised, right? And so they're all meeting and trying to divvy this stuff up. And Italy did gain control of some of these areas. However, Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points, which is considered this classic work in kind of liberal international politics, emphasized the right of the self-determination of nations. And that sort of set the tone for those discussions. As a result, a lot of those territories promised to Italy didn't go to Italy. And Italy was permitted to annex only a portion of the territory that it had already conquered in Dalmatia, and the rest went to Yugoslavia. And also, they were not able to get the port city of Fiume, and that was turned into an independent state. And it was the military in Italy called this the mutilated victory, right?
Yeah, kind of anticlimactic.
Yeah, that they won, but what did we get out of it, right? And in fact, as it turns out, right, none of the involved parties in the First World War really won all that much, right? It was just pretty horrendous.
It was just bloodshed on a galactic scale.
Yeah. Contrary to that movie Wonder Woman, which portrays the British and the Americans as the good guys in that war somehow.
Yeah, that was like an alternate history.
Yeah, exactly. Alternate history. Yeah. So.
Was the enemy a fascist in that movie?
It was funny. The enemy are the Germans, of course, and
right.
they're not Nazis, right? But they go out of their way to make them look and sound as close to Nazis as you can imagine. So they have like this evil scientist character who is working on this deadly gas, right? They're doing as much work as possible to try to foreshadow and get you to think about no, yeah. Remember, Germany's bad, even though not yet.
And then it's Gal Gadot who plays Wonder Woman, who is Israeli,
Yeah, she's real. Yeah.
which is also ironic.
Yes. Yes.
So okay, yeah.
Anyways,
Sorry,
yeah, no.
go ahead.
Anyways, yeah. So, post World War One, post Paris Peace Conference, the war had lasted longer and been more destructive than anyone had thought possible. The ideals of the progressive view of human civilization, right? That we're just going to keep getting better and better forever, right? Until we attain the end of history. That got totally discredited, right? None of the belligerents in the war achieved their goals. There was mutual exhaustion, delusionment, all that sort of stuff going around. The wartime economies that were put in place in Europe were dismantled too quickly, which only exacerbated the inflation problems that they're going through at the time. You've got soldiers returning from the trenches, totally PTSD'd out of their mind from trench warfare.
That was like a new sort of like concept at the time too, that like there was this subconscious that like, residually affected people, like in terms of a developing branch that of like understanding the human condition at the time too.
Yeah, and it was like the first mechanized version of mass warfare in Europe. We did see a bit of that in the Civil War in the United States, but not in Europe until World War One.
Right. And so alongside the war aspect of what's going on, you also have the advent of mass politics. So universal male suffrage was achieved in a lot of European countries through the European revolutions that all kind of came off in 1848. And so as a result of that, the left has grown very popular in Europe, and in particular after the Bolshevik Revolution, right? So Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, right? So big year.
Lenin, the mad lad himself.
Out of this crazy swamp, you get these three main ideologies that appear, right, and are contesting for dominance. You got liberalism, right, which sort of defined by Wilson's international self-determination, an emphasis on free markets and democracy. Now, in reality, the Wilsonian doctrine really just meant rule by the great powers and their client states. Obviously, which is what it's always meant. But the idea
is liberalism.
Exactly. The idea is that it's every nation is equal. Yeah, and you also have an emphasis on free markets. So obviously, not like what we would call liberalism today, right? This would be, classical. A classical liberalism.
You mean as it's understood, like in the American political context.
Yeah, 2020.
I'm so used to right. I'm so used to. We're not talking about like Al Franken or whatever. This is like in the classical sense. Yeah.
Okay. So alongside liberalism, you have conservatism, which is emphasizing international rule through force. Right? It's obviously very hostile to democracy. It believes in traditional social hierarchies. And from an economic point of view, it's whatever can get that done. So that could be protectionism in certain cases and not in others. It had a marginal influence in international affairs, mainly because of the influence of Woodrow Wilson. But then alongside of that, you have the good stuff, the right stuff, communism. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Go.
So communism's awesome, right? That we know that. It achieved its first huge victory right in Russia, but there were also these other local uprisings in places like Munich and Budapest that were put down.
Which they wanted to happen, right? Like
yeah.
the Bolsheviks' whole project was like, let's get this going everywhere that we possibly can.
International, yeah, links in the chain, right? Every country it's just going to be like a thing that pops off, yeah. So, but that being said, the communist revolution was for at least the moment limited to Russia. So you have three ideologies, none of which are totally winning people over. Right? It's and
the people now feel like they can the people now feel like they should be able to participate in politics to a certain extent. It's no longer like that painting of the founders like signing the Declaration of Independence where it's like the richest and smartest guys.
The original smoke-filled back room.
Right.
Exactly
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Now people are sort of like, involved more. At least men are.
Yeah, yes, yeah. And if you look back at the writing of Marx and Engels at the time, or Rosa Luxemburg and other, particularly German Marxists in the early part of the 20th century, they all said, oh yeah, of course communism is going to win because of universal mass suffrage, male suffrage, and just universal suffrage in general. We have the numbers, right? And that little did they know, right, that there's going to be this other thing that was going to happen, that was going to be a form of mass politics. So This brings us to our, I guess you could say, anti-hero. No, he's not an anti-hero. He's the villain, Benito Mussolini, right? So he's born on July 29th in the year 1883. In 1902, he immigrates to Switzerland to avoid compulsory military service. So that's actually kind of cool. But he studies Nietzsche. He studies the sociologist Vilfredo Pareto, who is most notable to probably people who have an economics degree. The Pareto efficiency, that term, right? It's a term used a lot in the neoclassical school. He also popularized the term elite as a category of people in political discourse. This guy also believed that democracy was a sham because it was always controlled by elites. He called for the reduction of the state and in order to allow pure economic forces to rule and to get rid of the corrupt elite. So, sound familiar, right? Where this is a little foreshadowing, a little taste of what's to come. And also, crucially though, Mussolini studied the work of syndicalist George Sorel. Okay? So
Yes.
Right. So you've got Nietzsche, who I'm not a Nietzsche scholar, but there are obviously so many wide interpretations of his work. But I think crucially though, Pareto, right, and George Sorel, the syndicalists, these are important, right? So before the First World War, he was a well-known member of the Italian Socialist Party. He even edited the party's newspaper and actually spoke out against the Italian war in Libya, saying it was an act of imperial aggression, this kind of thing. Eventually, he was expelled from the Italian Socialist Party, the PSI, for supporting Italian intervention in World War I. Right, so that's the first major bend, right?
But he's a leftist.
He's a leftist, but he is a leftist. He's a prominent leftist.
And I think we should also just include that that was a major point of contention or fracturing within the left was World War I itself, because a lot of the leftist parties, more like social democratic parties, some of them supported their nation, some of them didn't, and that was the end of the Second International.
Yeah. Famously, right. The Social Democratic Party in Germany split over this question. Yeah.
And the Americans,
yes.
too. The Americans were super split on whether, and that also was part of the downfall of the socialist movement in the United States, because they started cracking down on the socialists and passed the Alien and Sedition Acts and stuff. And one of the pieces that I'll talk about later, something that Trotsky wrote about the Nazis, he quotes Mussolini talking about Marx, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah.
Yeah. So the first major break though from what would otherwise be just a fairly typical leftist, if you didn't know who he was he gets expelled from the PSI for supporting Italian involvement in the First World War. Okay. And in
party discipline.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. 1915 is when he first establishes the Revolutionary Fascist Party. Okay. So, and at that point, so during the First World War, he's gathering forces. He's making alliances. He's gathering kind of a following. After World War I, his support for the war hardened, right? And he began, and he had this real coalition. So the first major group was demobilized war veterans. Again, traumatized from the war. They hated the politicians who betrayed them. They hated the society they came from, right? What a waste. You sent us there to do what? And returning, they felt entitled to rule the country that they had saved, right? But these ungrateful elites sent us there, and they won't even give us our due. And Mussolini himself actually did serve in the Italian military eventually. Second major group, you've got the pro-war syndicalists. Now, I should just back up and say that syndicalism, again, is a leftist political ideology, right? It has a lot of associations with anarchism. And so, again, very sincerely part of the left, right? But there was a group of pro-war syndicalists who called themselves the National Syndicalists. And they were Mussolini's closest associates during the struggle to bring Italy into war. And syndicalism was the main working class rival to parliamentary socialism in Europe before the First World War. So syndicalists wanted one big union to bring down capitalism at once, as opposed to these kind of piecemeal reforms. The other major group you have are a group of artists and intellectuals and writers called the Futurists. And they're not an organization. It's this loose collection of people who all supported this guy, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti's manifesto, a series of manifestos called, the Futurist Manifestos, which he began publishing in 1909. These manifestos dismissed the cultural legacy of the past. So they dismissed, they said all these museums you have erected are tawdry and pointless. All these libraries are useless. And they praised the liberating and vitalizing qualities of speed and violence. And there's a very famous quote from one of these manifestos that says, "A racing automobile is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace." Okay? So it's all about violence and speed. Okay, Mad Max, right?
And that was all. Oh man, that's a good connection too. But that was sort of like in line with what generally became a theme, which was like major anti-intellectualism.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Like blood and soil.
Action. Party of action. Yeah.
Yeah. The fist.
Yes. Yeah. And then a fourth group, and this is sort of less well defined even, is the supporters of what was called the Second Risorgimento. Okay, they wanted a national revolution to create a new state, and it was kind of this group of people who all shared this kind of nationalist ideology. Okay, so March 23rd, 1919. Okay, in Milan, at the Milan Industrial and Commercial Alliance, Mussolini and his core of supporters meet, and they too declare a war against socialism because it opposed nationalism. One interesting thing I think that's really important to keep in mind here is that Italian fascism was not initially anti-Semitic. That's really, really important because a lot, right? When we're talking,
I thought they were like almost reluctantly so. Wasn't it more enforced after in 43?
Yeah, once you get further into the war and things get a little bit more desperate, yeah. But initially, I mean, there were a lot of Jews who were some of Mussolini's biggest backers initially. A lot of his initial funders were actually Jews. So yeah, Italian fascism and anti-Semitism are not inherently connected in any way. That would be, and we're going to get more into this, but Paxton defines these 5 stages of fascism that he calls. And so what I've just described, all this kind of coalescing and forming of alliances, is what he calls creating the movement. So that's kind of like the first phase, okay? So the second phase is taking root. It's when you actually really get support going and really build a party. So the example...
So Dakota, 1 second. Are you going to talk about where they got the money from? Because I thought that was funny when I read.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, no.
They just got funded by like these like rich guys who were like either like, I think it was like, it might have been like someone's uncle or something, but it was just like relatives. So it's sort of hard to like imagine that it was just like some organic like grassroots movement, but like today we would call it AstroTurf.
Right. Yes. It totally Koch brothers shit. Yeah.
They should have robbed banks like the Bolsheviks.
That was cool. Yeah. The Tiflis Bank Square robbery. One of the cool. Yeah. Anyways, okay. So first stage is creating the movement. Okay, so you've got your movement. Now you need to take root. And the example that Paxton uses is in a region of northern Italy, a rural area called the Po Valley. Okay, and so he focuses on the years of 1920 to 1922. In 1919, Mussolini lost an election and he lost it badly. Okay, afterwards, Mussolini's followers invented the now infamous technique or organization rather called the Squadrismo tactic, right? Which are these colloquially known as black shirts, and they are these strong arm squads that are designed to attack what are called internal enemies. Okay, so it was actually, again, not actually Mussolini, but his followers who came up with that, and that's going to be a trope that we're going to see with Mussolini throughout his rule.
Okay, yeah, like he's kind of the Il Duce, right? Like the main guy, like the figurehead in some ways too, but like and this is the true for Hitler too, although he ended up like purging a lot of them, but like you find that the people low down on the chain are like the more radical ones that are like more likely to take part in these like direct action type things. Like the dudes you're talking about would literally just be like walking around town beating the shit out of like striking laborers.
Yeah,
right?
Just basically groups of thugs that just go around beating the shit out of people. So yeah, you even have a kind of a premonition, or rather a prefiguring of what would become of Mussolini in the figure of this guy named Gabriele D'Annunzio, who is a national celebrity and a veteran from the First World War. He actually lost his eye from doing all these bombing raids. So he's kind of like, that Solid Snake.
He's
eye patch.
I was going to say Dan Crenshaw.
Yeah, he's also Dan Crenshaw. Yeah, he's Dan Crenshaw. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he actually led a raid of that city I mentioned earlier that was awarded to Yugoslavia, Fiume, right? It was the port city, because Wilson and the great powers, they all declared that was an international city. So it was technically controlled by Yugoslavia, but yeah. So D'Annunzio said, nah. He actually drew support in that raid from the quote unquote nationalist left and the interventionist syndicalists. Okay, this takeover was crushed though. Okay, so it was done away with. The government did away with it. Okay, but that's a little kind of teaser, right, of what's to come. However, what this did demonstrate to Mussolini was that he had to jettison the left nationalist rhetoric. Okay, because when Mussolini and his coalition met at that Milan, that commercial center in Milan, the platform they articulated had a lot of, it was all over the place, right? It had a lot of strong military language, but it also said we don't want to get involved, right? But then it also said we want to empower workers and we want to harmonize class relations. So he realized, though, that the lesson he took from that is you got to get rid of the left stuff because that's not a winning ticket, okay? And he used the black shirts to crush socialists and southern Slavs, okay?
And also starts the sort of what would become another trend of just like picking and choosing from different like ideologies and intellectual traditions, whatever makes the most sense at the moment, so that you don't really end up with like a consistent program or ideology. It's just like a mishmash of whatever seems like it'll work.
Right, exactly.
It's called being pragmatic, Jeff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mussolini,
Right.
he understood you can't do purity politics. You know, unlike
Yeah.
look what happened to Bernie. You know, he's doing all this purity shit.
There you go.
Yeah, and so one of the things that Paxton emphasizes, is that in the early stages, there are these intellectual traditions that fascism is drawing from. Again, never totally coherent. There's never a moment when fascism is actually a coherent ideology. But in the early phases of fascism, there is actually a focus on, and intellectuals are brought into the movement to give it some grounding. But once you start to take power, you got to just jettison a lot of this stuff to get power.
And a lot of them left by themselves too,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
Like they like moved to different countries because they got freaked out.
Yeah, they felt betrayed. Yeah, and so the black shirts basically worked on behalf of the landowning class in the Po Valley, and they were used to crush socialists in the area. They also gave some peasants small parcels of land though to try to win them over from socialism. So again, you've already got like kind of this incoherent politics going on. I don't. It even went so far as to occupy whole cities, and throughout this entire time, they were supported by the local police and army. So you've got to imagine it would be like if President Trump had to call up like the fascist party leader if he wanted to like get anywhere in Mississippi, like this totally like parallel organization that was not actually formally in power, but that just had so much control over the area that ordinary politicians had to deal with these people, right?
Sort of like a mafia type thing almost.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so it was at this time that, Mussolini began to jettison all of his left policies. He abandoned the idea of empowering workers. He abandoned his critique of religion, because you got to remember that Italy, the Vatican, right? I mean, the Catholic Church is huge in Italy, right? He abandoned his critique of religion. He abandoned the idea of progressive taxation. And what he settled on that really mattered was he wanted a revolution against socialism and liberalism, okay? All right. So in May of 1921, the left-wing, left-of-center Prime Minister, Giolitti, he actually included fascists in his electoral coalition to gain power. And as a result, Mussolini is elected to the Italian chamber. Okay, that's the first step into actual formal political power. All right.
That same year was when he turned the fascist movement into an official party,
Yeah.
which a lot of the rank and file, like radicals in the fascist movement, were not happy with.
Not happy at all. Yeah. And so now we move into the third phase, getting power.
Because they hated parliamentarians.
Oh yeah,
right?
they hated. And so there was all this wringing of hands about, you betrayed the movement. We're not a party. Yeah, yeah. So again, purity politics is not exclusive to the left. Some of the early fascist radicals actually cared about it. Yeah. But anyways, okay, on to getting power. So crucially, again, fascists do not take power through a straight election. They don't get power just by getting elected. They also, though, do not get elected by a coup. It's very important, okay? And just as a bit of background to contextualize what's going on in Italy at the time, modern-day Italy has a head of state, the president, and an executive branch, the prime minister. At the time, though, the head of state was the king, okay? King Victor Emmanuel III. So you've got the king and you've got the prime minister. These are the two positions holding power in Italy. At the time, so you got the leftist government, Giolitti's government, was divided and unpopular. You've got the Marxists, who are themselves divided from the maximalists and the reformists. You've got this group called the Christian Democrats. You've got these conservatives. Nobody has a clear majority, though. So there's basically deadlock, right? Nobody can implement their agenda fully. All right. Giolitti tried even to dismantle the squadristi, but he failed. August 1921 rolls around. Mussolini signs the Pacification Pact with the leaders of the PSI in order to put an end to the violence that was going on between the black shirts and the socialists, but the black shirts forced him to renounce it.
Wow.
Again, so yeah, that's how radical these guys were, that Mussolini tried to do the olive branch or at least do a stalemate, but his own base said, nah, we're doing this for real.
So he's still sort of accountable to these guys at this point.
Exactly. Yep. November rolls around. Mussolini, he officially renames his party the National Fascist Party. Okay. February of 1922, the government loses a vote of confidence and is totally plunged into chaos. All that the socialists could agree on at the time was that they wanted a general strike to protest the black shirts and to reinforce sort of, quote, rule of law. Okay. Now you can question whether that was even a good idea. But all this did actually was help Mussolini because it created a perceived communist threat in the country.
Yeah. Because the socialists were the one calling for the general strike.
Yep. So flash forward to October of 1922. Fast forward to 1922, October, the March on Rome, right? Here we go. This is the big moment.
This is
the movie moment, right?
And this is... I remember Paxton's like, okay, we got to be explicit about this. He breaks down into the numbers, right? Like, because a lot of people think like, oh, like Mussolini like totally like marched on Rome and like overwhelmed the city, and you know, he had a force ready. He like marshaled a force ready to like take on the might of the Italian military.
It was a giant bluff.
It was basically the movie 300, right? That's what happened. Is the movie?
Yeah. And I just want to add, like, right before the March on Rome, I'm not even sure. It was literally the same month. Mussolini publicly declared that he would basically leave the monarchy intact and wouldn't threaten the monarchy.
That's smart. Yeah. So here are the numbers. Yeah. So let's be specific. So initially, 30,000 fascists descended on Rome. Okay. Now 30,000. That's a big number. Sounds like a big number. However,
it's a lot of facts.
However, in reality, the vast majority of those marchers were stopped by the police on their way there. So by the time you actually get to the gates of Rome, they're about 9,000. Okay? They are ill-equipped. They are hungry. It's raining out. It's not the great, glorious victory that Italian fascist propaganda has made it seem like it was. Okay? And it was a bluff, right? It was a bluff. And there was a great quote Paxton references from this German historian who says, his name is Martin Brozat. He says, quote, in ancient and modern history, there was hardly any attempt on Rome that failed so miserably at its beginning. So kind of gives you a sense of what this actually was.
Yeah, which also is consistent with, like, you know, the fact that, you know, I don't know, like, Mao called them paper tigers, right? Like, you sort of have these like sort of bumbling idiots who just like have a lot of like bluff and bluster, but like are kind of not the most smooth operators.
Right. And it is one of the weird contradictions of fascism that you have on the one hand this ruthless efficiency in some areas and then just total bumbling on the other, you know?
But they pulled it off.
They pulled
off the bluff, right?
Yeah. So they pulled off the king.
So was Mussolini wasn't personally there, right?
No, he showed up a little bit later.
He showed up later.
Yeah, he showed up later.
It was clear.
Yeah, to get the photos. There's some great photos of him looking like just a total alpha male G, standing around with all of the black shirts. So the king does not call his bluff, though. Okay, the king rejects the prime minister's call for martial law, and he rejects the former prime minister's call for just to create a new conservative government without Mussolini in it. Okay.
Okay, so we see
that's a fork in the road.
Yes, I want to have that be a theme of the episode, right? Where we talk about the forks in the road. If we were to go back and be like, you should probably have hit Command Z on that one. And actually, like, that would have been a relatively simple decision on his part, right? Like, okay, cool, martial law. And then it turns out that they probably would have just gone home.
Yep, probably.
Or maybe there would have been some isolated skirmishes or something.
To be fair, They did crush. I mean, I didn't do my timeline yet, but they did crush Hitler's coup attempt, and he still came to power. So
Good point.
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe they would have come back. My point is that we can identify, and Paxton makes this point too. We can identify points that during the the taking root and also the seizure of power of the fascists, where if existing political and social elites had made different decisions, or things had worked out differently, it could have turned out very differently than it
Absolutely.
did.
Yeah. And so let's talk about why the king did not call his bluff. So the king did not want to risk bloodshed. Okay, one. He also didn't like the idea of his troops fraternizing with the black shirts. And he actually, this is kind of involves a whole other story, but basically he was afraid of his cousin, who was this duke, and he was afraid that if he clamped down on this, that would open up a possibility for his cousin to do a coup on him. It's kind of, it's a whole other thing. But yeah, so there's all this kind of stuff going on. But also, crucially, there's the fear of communism. Okay? And because any attempt to shut down the right could potentially redound to the left. Right? And that's that. So talking about the forks in the road.
The common theme of any like Nazi collaborator, or not Nazi, but rather fascist collaborator who aren't inherently fascist themselves, whether it's conservatives or capital or royalty, it's all self-preservation.
Yep.
They see self-preservation through allying with fascists as opposed to opposing them.
Yeah. I mean, we'll find out that it's like I think I wrote down what Trotsky describes this as, like a mobilization of the middle classes against the proletariat. Like, so that's like they are understanding the threat of communism as well, and of the left, which seems to be ever present. Like, people are freaked out.
Spectre haunting the globe. Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so as a result of all these reasons, Mussolini is directly offered the role of prime ministership. So it's handed to him. He didn't win it. It's not a coup. It's not an election. He was handed to it. And after taking office, it's pretty funny. Mussolini orders this like another march on Rome, just like a reenactment to like make it look good. And then
Woodstock 94.
Yeah, exactly. Woodstock, and there is, like Woodstock 94, there's a lot of violence at this one. Now, this time, there's a lot of violence.
That was Woodstock 99. It's 69, 94, and then 99. So, like, 99 is like...
Was 99 where they got the Hells Angels to be the security, and it just, like, a bunch of
No, that was like a Rolling Stones concert. Woodstock 99 was like... There were just, like, riots and fires that started during... when the Red Hot Chili Peppers were playing... Fire by Jimi Hendrix, and like a lot of people got sexually assaulted and
oh my God,
and beat up, but nobody died. I'm pretty sure.
Okay, well, that's good.
It's pretty amazing.
Right. Okay. Well, there we go. So now Mussolini is in power, and so for the first 2 years, you have this period where you got the fascists and the conservatives sort of hammering out this power sharing arrangement, and it's a very dicey time. Right, you're going back and forth. You're hemming and hawing. Right, no one side is kind of saying, "Okay, let's do it my way or the highway." And so their powers in their first days in office, Mussolini's power in his first days in office, but also Hitler, they were constrained by having to govern in coalition. Right, even though the Fascist Party held some vital posts in the government, it was only a minority of cabinet positions. And so for the first 2 years, he basically governs like a normal authoritarian conservative prime minister. However, the squadristi are continuing to pressure him from below with acts of violence against parliament. And this period of normalcy ends decisively with the murder of the secretary of the Italian Socialist Party, a guy named Giacomo Matteotti. So pour one out for Giacomo. He gets assassinated.
Who got him?
The black shirts got him. Yep.
Wow. Okay, that's what I thought. I tried to remember that accurately. So you have this like revolt of the most radical faction of the party that's in power, sort of flexing their muscle against the to make sure that their guys don't become compromised.
Right. Exactly.
For making the backroom deals sometimes necessary to exercise state power, especially when you're in a coalition with conservatives.
Right. Yep. After that, the fascist militias gave Mussolini an ultimatum. They said, crush your opposition and establish a one-party state, or we will do it for you. Very decisive moment, right? Where his own supporters, his own hardcore party members said, either you do this or we will. And Mussolini gave in. And he announced, we're going to fully radicalize, we're going to become a one-party dictatorship. Okay? Decisive moment. The fascist party created parallel organizations at every level, or they had parallel organizations at every level, and this whole process unfolded. But then Mussolini declared, quote, the revolution is over, after consolidating power. He supported, or rather he subordinated his own parallel orgs to the state, okay? He's trying to keep a lid on his own supporters because he's afraid of them, okay? Even though he needs them, right? And so the conservative, and this whole, what we're going to see throughout Mussolini's actual time in office is that he starts off radical, but then very quickly it decays into a sort of traditional authoritarian state. It gets radical at the very, very end again when things get really bad, but this process of decay is really what's important here. Contrast that with Hitler, which just went off the rails, right? I mean, that's the definition of that's the furthest radicalization you can get to, basically, is with Hitler.
The vibe I get from like comparing Mussolini and Hitler is like Mussolini like bit off more than he could chew and just kind of had to keep like chewing and dealing with it, whereas like Hitler intentionally took a huge bite and like thought he could take care of it the whole time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And so the conservative forces in government forced Mussolini to give favorable treatment to the Catholic Church. So they made an official treaty with the Catholic Church. Mussolini fully jettisoned his syndicalist allies and declared his allegiance to the business community.
Wow. So two face turns. He used to be an atheist, right? Like a vocal atheist, and he was also, an anti-capitalist, at least nominally.
Yeah, and so he had this real challenge internally, though. He had the local Raz, which is basically his local chieftains, these leaders of the Squadristi. They had all this autonomous power. And Mussolini really wanted to normalize his relations with conservatives. And as we remember, it was the Raz who forced him to give up that pacification pact with the socialists back in August of 1921. And so, essentially, he ruled through this combination of what Paxton calls accommodation, enthusiasm, and terror. So, on the terror part, coming to power, Mussolini killed far more people than Hitler ever did, his movement, to get to power. The black shirts, extremely violent. It's interesting, though, his dictatorship, very mild compared to Hitler.
Right. But a lot of the people they killed were like internal political enemies, especially leftists and Marxists, right?
Yeah. And so they had these forced relocation camps at offshore islands for political prisoners. But aside from that, though, the number of people killed in his entire reign, only 9. Only 9 political prisoners killed in his entire regime.
Wow.
So the bulk of the intimidation stuff mainly aimed at socialist Slavs and African people, right? Because Italy was conducting or had conducted and would continue to conduct campaigns in like Ethiopia and stuff. He really tried to harmonize, he tried to harmonize class relations within Italian corporations. He tried to set up these boards where workers and bosses would have the same, power, but that basically completely failed for obvious reasons. He attempted to co-opt youth groups and set up youth groups and leisure associations and these rallies and this kind of thing to get the young people involved. And a lot of these programs worked. They did have some success, although a lot of that was due to the support from the Catholic Church. And so, crucially, he left property rights and the existing economic and social hierarchy intact. And even his early rhetoric never attacked wealth or capitalism directly. And the economic, however, that being said, the early rhetoric and the actual economic policy was where Mussolini most diverged. Okay, that was the biggest shift once he got into power. And Paxton sort of talks about how war is the clearest radicalizing impulse for fascism. And so, of course, Mussolini conducted numerous campaigns. He conducted an invasion of Ethiopia, and that actually fully aligned him with Hitler against Britain and France. At that point, this was in the 1930s, so he'd been in power for, like a decade basically at this point. And he was worried about his his organization, his party getting complacent. He wanted something to reinvigorate them. Popular support was waning. So he revived the Risorgimento with the campaign in Ethiopia. And that actually was one of the big leaps. It was called the Cultural Revolution of Italy. And it was kind of this leap where there were all these new fascist customs and fascist language and all. And that's where you start to see the first glimmerings of racial legislation in Italy. Was
Got
after.
It. Yeah, and imperialism and colonialism were, two endeavors that were shared by both regimes.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Both of their like colonial or expansionist ambitions were crushed by World War I, especially the Germans, but also the Italians, as Dakota highlighted earlier.
So yeah, and he has so Ethiopia's a big one. Also, there's a campaign in Greece, and then crucially though, by 1938, and so in the year 1938, that's when you have the Manifesto of Fascist Racism, official policy. And that was the first time you start to have these policies against intermarriage. Jews were excluded from government service and certain jobs. So now you actually get an Italian fascism that is anti-Semitic.
And was his anti-Semitism was reformed by that had already been like institutionalized or seen in Germany at that point?
Exactly.
Is that the case?
Well, yeah, because early on, there was a resistance to the anti-Semitic stuff that Hitler tried to get Mussolini more on board with that, but it was and so the roots of that. So in terms of anti-Semitism, you've got the racial discrimination going on in Libya and Ethiopia, right? These Italian colonies. You also have, again, the Catholic Church, which at that time, before the Vatican reforms, right? I believe it was Vatican II. You have the Catholic Church referring to Jews as the deicide people, the people who killed Christ, right? So not exactly great.
Not great. Not great, folks.
Yeah, not great, folk. We don't like that. Okay, so June 1940, Mussolini takes Italy into World War II. Yay!
The big
now
one.
this is where American history actually matters, right? If you go to
and it's like the ultimate manifestation of the fascist program, which is just war.
Exactly.
Like, the beauty of violence. It's what they wanted the whole time. After they went out to this horrible war in World War I, and they didn't quite get what they wanted. So Mussolini has to take them back into the grand national adventure that they viewed as World War II.
I would say like this is officially where they make their decision in stage 5, where it's radicalization or entropy.
Yeah.
And they went full head into radicalization. I think, I don't know if he's quoting somebody else or it's his quote himself, but Paxson says a war is like the strongest engine of radicalization.
Yeah.
Whether it's in building a fascist movement or expressing it in stage 5.
Right. Yep.
Probably good for the capitalists too,
yeah.
because they get to marshal their forces of production and make a shit ton of money.
And so, interestingly, upon entering World War II, Mussolini also begins a parallel war, trying to assert his equality with Hitler, and he conducts campaigns in Greece and France. But these both lead to defeat eventually and to the end of Mussolini's credibility. So fast forward, so we all know World War II, right? This is American history again, right? This is the one where America was awesome and totally won World War II on its own, whatever. Okay, July 25th, 1943, the Allies land in Italy. The Fascist Grand Council votes to restore full authority to the king. And they have the Duce arrested, okay? He's arrested, folks. Unfortunately, on September 12th, there is a German commando raid which rescues Mussolini. And they actually reinstate him, this kind of breakaway sect, they reinstate him as dictator of the Italian Social Republic, which sort of is based in Salo. Okay?
Yeah, Salo.
Yeah, Salo.
Right.
Also the name of Pasolini's last movie, right? Which is kind of takes the Marquis de Sade's
yes.
writing and sets it in Salo during the end of it's this kind of thing where they set it actually at the end of Mussolini's rule. So it's interesting. Anyways, super fucked up movie. Anyways, he is the dictator for a very, very short period of time of this kind of, crumbling breakaway Italian social republic. But he is freed from the church, the king, and the financial and industrial leaders of Italy. And at that point is when you see a reversion to the radicalism of his early days. He declares a populist national socialism. So to socialism. However, this is not really ever implemented, mainly because he didn't have time, because he's killed later, very soon after this. But he declared that he was going to, quote, socialize important industries. He conducted mass murder campaigns all throughout Italy. He rounded up Jews and put them into concentration camps. He liquidated people he thought betrayed them, until the partisans finally tracked him down and killed him.
Right. And strung him up upside down
Strung him
in
up
the town
upside
square,
down,
right?
yeah. And now we all get to deal with his granddaughter.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
Jesus
she's
Christ.
going on.
Who was a porn star?
Who's a porn star?
too.
She was in the parliament, right? Yeah, she's in a lot of jobs, wore a lot of hats.
You can Google it. You can find her tits on the internet. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, in addition to being the granddaughter of Mussolini. And so,
Jesus.
so now
she's still a fascist.
still fast, still going hard. But that is the tawdry, pathetic end, fittingly so, of Benito Mussolini, and with him his regime.